move to the main business of today's meeting, which is an In Conversation with event with Alex O'Connor. Alex is the host of the Within Reason podcast, the creator and founder of the CosmicSkeptic YouTube channel, and a fierce debater. So anyone willing to go up against him today, better watch out. Today, the style of event will be a more symposium-style event. So I'll ask a few questions with Alex, and then we'll move to the audience, and then the audience will say something, Alex will respond, and then hopefully the next question you can either comment on something Alex just said, or a question that the previous person had asked. We're going to try and get a conversation going. Brilliant. So shall we start?
Fine by me.
So, you used to be a notorious vegan. Notorious because you spoke about it a lot.
Yes.
Am I right? And then we spoke about it over dinner a bit, and you said there is philosophical underpinnings, but there are other elements to it. So why did you stop being a vegan?
Yeah, so I mean, it's quite an uninteresting story that sounds like any other used to be vegan story, which is that practically speaking, I couldn't keep it up. Mm-hmm. There was a philosophical undertone to my vegan advocacy, which I no longer believe in. But it is a bit suspicious that the timing of that philosophical shift happens around the time when you're practically struggling to keep something up. And so there's certainly scope for motivated reasoning there, which is why, although I do genuinely look at it differently, I'm cautious to say that that was strictly the reason why I stopped, because I don't think it would be true. So I always like to preface anything I say by pointing out that, I just couldn't keep it up practically. Though philosophically, the main thrust of veganism and the big end of the funnel, if you like, is factory farming. Factory farming is... You want me to use the mic?
If you
Do you think that you can... Would that be better? Would that be helpful? Sorry, I was projecting sort of this way. Yeah. The thrust of veganism, I think, comes from factory farming. I do think that, of course, a lot of vegans do say that they're against the use and exploitation of animals for food no matter what, as a matter of principle, rights-based vegans. And they do exist, but I think there would be a lot less vegans, and even vegans of that kind, because that's a position which often develops after somebody starts learning about animal agriculture, starts getting into a vegan community. I think there would be a lot less of them if factory farming had never developed. Factory farming kind of started by accident, by the way. There's this story of a chicken farmer who meant to order 30 chickens, but accidentally put an extra zero and got 300. And realised that if you just cram them all into a room, you can still get the products, and realised that this is probably the way to go forward. So factory farming is a moral abomination. I still think it's probably the greatest moral emergency that we face, which is a controversial statement, but when I explain what I mean, I think less so, in that, of course, there are lots of problems with our world. Human trafficking is still something we should attempt to solve. There are more people in slavery today than there were at the height of the transatlantic slave trade. But if you asked anybody in the street what they thought about these practices, there is no way that they would be agnostic, and certainly not say that they would justify its existence because of some sophistic reference to the fact that it's what we've been doing for thousands of years, or it's natural, which is exactly the kind of rhetoric that you hear when people talk about veganism, and it's not taken seriously. In fact, not too long ago, Charlie Kirk, who some of you may have heard of, was approached at one of his events by somebody who stood up and said, I want to talk about something. I'd appreciate it if you could take me seriously. I want to talk about the exploitation of animals for food and consumption. And everybody starts laughing. And Charlie Kirk says, oh, did you lose a bet? And it's just not taken seriously. We're talking about some of the worst imaginable suffering that you could even conceivably inflict upon an animal, and we're doing it regularly and unnecessarily. And when someone even tries to bring it up as a topic, they're not taken morally seriously, not least by people like Charlie Kirk. But also, can you imagine it coming up in Parliament? Can you imagine somebody making part of their political campaign in their manifesto? Animal welfare isn't even mentioned. Maybe it's mentioned in the Green parties or something, I don't know. But it's not a serious issue. But since I started this talk, millions, hundreds of millions, billions if you include fish, of animals have been killed. Since I started this talk, so that we can consume their flesh. So I think it's an emergency in that sense. But what often happens is you sort of get deep into the philosophy and you think, well, what's going on with animal consumption? I think it's wrong. Like, what's the difference between a pig and a human relevantly that would diminish their rights? And you start to think that animal consumption of any kind is wrong. I don't believe that. I don't think that would always be wrong. But factory farming certainly is. And so the question is then, how do we best tackle factory farming? And I think we probably need to see a shift similar to what we've seen in the environmentalist movement, which is that a few decades ago, environmentalism was all about turning off your lights and not leaving the tap running. And now that kind of seems like a bit of a joke. Clearly the way to solve the problem is institutional. It's more about protests, it's more about lobbying, and I think we need to see a similar thing happen to factory farming, which should end yesterday.
Do you think that maybe we should anthropomorphize the rights that we give animals, or do you think that the ramifications on our human rights will throw a spanner in those works?
I don't think we need to do that. I also don't really like the language of rights. I think it is quite useful in some contexts, and I understand why people use it in a human context, but even in a human context, rights do not exist. Some people think they do. They believe that there's a real quality of the universe that gives people rights, which is a little bit strange to me. I think rights are a sort of conceptual tool that we use. And interestingly, when you start actually analysing what a right is, people have different definitions. For some people, a right is an inviolable claim that you have on someone else. But that word of inviolability, that concept, is quite tricky, because if you have a right to life, for example, well, what if you start attacking me? Can I then kill you? You have a right to life, but you're attacking me. Can I kill you? And the way you answer that question will determine your philosophy of rights, because some people say, yeah, well, okay, you have a right to life, but that's just a shorthand. The real right that you have, if you were to spell it out, would be like a right to the preservation of your life unless you're threatening somebody else's. And it's like, okay, well, what if I strap an innocent person onto the front of a tank and run it towards you, and the only way you can stop it is by killing them? Okay, maybe that would be okay too. And so you end up sort of qualifying rights. So I think they call it qualificationism or something about rights, which is that what rights actually are a series of really hyper-specific, carved out, gerrymandered moral principles that sort of take into account every single possible circumstance of which we violated. Other people's answer to the question is to say that actually it just means that sometimes rights can be violated. And then to me, I think we've lost the thrust of what a right is entirely. So I don't think rights actually exist. I think it's useful to treat them like they do, but they don't. So I certainly don't think they exist when it comes to animals. Anthropomorphizing rights would be silly. I mean, giving an animal the right to vote or something would just be absolutely ridiculous. Having said that, I don't think it's an anthropomorphizing effort to say that suffering matters no matter who's suffering it. People already think that it should be criminalized to torture animals, animal abuse, when spoken of in those contexts, right? If when the footballer Kurt Zuma, I don't know if anybody here saw this, the West Ham footballer drop-kicked his cat across the kitchen and for some reason filmed it on Snapchat and uploaded it. Everybody, his team, the mayor of London was on Good Morning Britain calling him a disgrace. His own fans were screaming at him on the pitch. All kinds of, you imagine what football chants are usually like, let alone, I think, he got tackled at one point and they started shouting, "That's how your cat feels, that's how your cat feels." People were very upset about it, and in fact, the RSPCA eventually confiscated Kurt Zuma's cat because he kicked it across the floor. That's the same RSPCA that officially approves, as a method of the dispatching of piglets who are too sick to be profitable, something which is colloquially known as thumping, blunt force trauma. The way to dispatch of these piglets who are not going to make you any money is to take them by the hind legs, crash their skulls into the pavement until they die. That same RSPCA, which officially approves that as a method of dispatching of pigs unnecessarily, confiscated Kurt Zuma's cat because he kicked it across the floor. Which of those animals would you rather be? There was a high welfare farm, I think somewhere in Scotland, but I can't remember which one it was, so I don't want to defame it by naming it, which was found, a high welfare farm, meaning it sort of passed all the tests, which was found to be killing piglets by taking them by the hind legs and smashing their skulls in against the bars of the cages that its own mother was being kept in. It's abominable. And so I think the idea that, to the extent that we think that that's wrong, it's not anthropomorphizing to say that is wrong. And if there is such thing as a right, just conceptually, that right to at least the avoidance of suffering should extend to animals. But no, we don't need to start getting silly with it. Peter Singer writes about this in Animal Liberation. He's sort of the godfather of the animal rights movement. He actually took this out of his updated edition. If you read the version from 1975, the way he explains this is to say that what we want is equal consideration, not equal rights. And the way he explains that is to say, if we want gender equality, That means equal consideration for men and women. It doesn't mean that you give men abortion rights. You don't give them the same rights, you give them the same consideration, because it doesn't make sense to give men abortion rights. As you can imagine, when he went to revisit animal liberation, you can probably imagine why he decided to take that out. But you understand the point that he's making, which is that you don't need to have an equality of treatment to have an equality of consideration. And I don't think it's controversial to extend that to animals, unless you're talking about food, in which case it's taken so unseriously that you will be literally laughed out of the room by people who generally pride themselves on being willing to have challenging and confronting conversations. It's a joke.
Moving on from animal rights, I don't mean, you might have to stick with this question, but why are you here? I don't mean why you sat here in front of me. I mean, why are you here in Durham? You made the decision to come after we invited you, and we're very happy for that. I'm very grateful. But was it preordained that you were to come here? My question gets at, you spoke about free will a lot, and I'm curious as to whether you think it was preordained you are here today.
Yes, why am I at the second best university in the world? No, I will not elaborate. I don't believe in free will. Although, as I keep saying to people as of late, I am agnostic about most things. Not because I don't have a view. Like, I'm pretty convinced that free will doesn't make sense as a concept. But just because I think it's so easy to be catastrophically wrong in so many ways that I'm just constantly aware that, like, this I could have missed something crucial at the basis of this thought, right? Free will, at least the kind of free will that I'm talking about, is like agency over your actions, your ability to control what you do. If you rewound the clock, you could have done something else. You could have worn a different shirt today. You could have not come to this talk, something like that. I don't think that exists. That conversation is tied up intimately with the question of determinism. Is everything preordained? But that's not the same question, I think. Like, there could be a universe that is not predetermined, and yet you don't have control over your actions. You know, like a tree does not have control over the way in which it sways, but even in a non-deterministic universe, it wouldn't have control. The interesting question is, like, to what extent are we the authors of our own actions? And for me, there are lots of ways of looking at this, but a good philosophical entry point to this is to consider the behaviours that you do, any kind of action that you ever perform. You either do it because you want to or because you're forced to. Those are the only two options. Anytime you do anything at all, consciously at least. You do it because you want to or because you're forced to. If you come to this talk, it's because you wanted to come to the talk or because you were forced to by some person or something. Now, you might say, okay, well, I didn't really want to come to this talk, but, you know, I thought that, like, it might be good for this reason or that reason, but I didn't really want to. You know, I went to the gym earlier, but I didn't really want to go to the gym. Okay, but we've got to be comprehensive in our analysis here. You didn't want to go to the gym, but you did want to be healthy. You wanted to stay at home and be lazy, but you also wanted to be healthy. Which of those things did you want more? Well, for a fact, we know that what you wanted more was to go to the gym, because that's what you ended up doing. And had the desires been stronger in the other direction, you would have done the other thing. So when you've got a choice in front of you and you're trying to figure out which one you want more, you don't so much decide which one you want more, as you just find out. I mean, like, presumably most of you right now would prefer, if I gave you the option between having a strawberry milkshake and slapping your mother in the face, you would prefer to have a strawberry milkshake. And crudely speaking, I would ask you to try to want the other one. Try to make the other one more desirable. Not the same thing as choosing to do it. Choose to make it more desirable. You can't just do that. You can't control your desires in that way. It's like, okay, well, I could force myself to go and think about my mother in the worst possible terms and, like, try to compel myself to... And yeah, you could sort of control your wants that way. But you'd have to want to do that in order to do that. And you wouldn't be able to control how much you wanted to do that. In other words, you just push the problem back. So, I think you only ever do anything because you want to or because you're forced to. There's a balance of essentially desires. Conscious action it presupposes that there is a way you want the world to be that it is currently not. That's why we act. You know, I pick up a glass of water and drink it because I'm thirsty and I would prefer not to be thirsty. Preference governs actions. But also I'm talking right now, so I don't want to pick up the water. Which of those desires is stronger? My desire to keep talking or the desire to drink the water? Well, you already know the answer to that question without having to scan my brain because of my behaviours. I don't get to choose that. That's completely outside of my control. As Schopenhauer famously put it, as one of our speakers quoted in the debate last night, you can do whatever you will, but you can't will what you will. And that's the crucial thing. So, is the universe determined or not? I don't know. But that to me is completely irrelevant to the question of whether you have control over your actions. Of course, if the universe is not determined, a lot of people think that's because there's some kind of randomness in physics. Either everything is following a set path from the Big Bang, or maybe at the quantum level there's some kind of randomness going on. I always like to remind people that randomness is by definition something that you are also not in control of. If something is determined, it means that you can't help but do it. If something is random, which is to say indeterminate, that's the definition of not being in control. So either way, you're not in control of your actions because you're not in control of your wants. But as I say, I think that's a robust philosophical case, but the universe is full of mysteries. And who knows, there might be some way to make sense of this. I mean, an analogy I often give is that I could very compellingly, I think, argue why consciousness can't exist. It doesn't make any sense. You know, we live in a materialistic universe and there are atoms bumping into each other, biological evolution, and then what? Somewhere along this evolves first-person conscious experience that can immaterially imagine triangles and things. And no way, I could make a very comprehensive argument as to why consciousness doesn't exist, and yet it just does, and we don't know why, and it's a great mystery. And maybe free will's a bit like that, I'm not sure, but philosophically speaking, I don't think it has very good grounding.
You've spoken about arguments for the existence of God quite a lot. Which one do you think is the most valid, and where does it finally fall short?
My favourite argument for the existence of God is the argument for the existence of God from the sheer number of arguments for the existence of God. It is stunning that no matter where you look, you can construct some kind of argument for God. Try doing that with anything else. Try doing that with any other philosophical position, or certainly with atheism. I mean, this microphone exists, and there's an argument from contingency. That contingent objects like this microphone prove God's existence. There's an argument from beauty, if you look at a beautiful flower. And there's an argument from consciousness, which is the brain that you're using. Any way you look, there is some kind of argument you can construct for God's existence. So I think that's quite compelling. But more specifically, I mean, depends what you mean. If you mean for me, I'm very fascinated by the existence of objects, and something like a contingency argument, which traces a series of causation. But when people talk about things needing a cause, they often forget, I think, that there are more than one kind of causation, or they might not know, right? As I once didn't know when I was younger. When you think of causation, you think of something going back in time. Think of something that happened before causing what happened now. So if you see a series of dominoes falling over, and I say, well, what caused that domino to fall over? The one before it. And that was caused by the one before it. And that was caused by the one before it. And it sort of goes backwards in time. And so an atheist can come along and look at the causation of things that happen. Everything that's happening right now seems to have some kind of cause. Maybe that just goes back infinitely. Maybe we don't really know what's back there, or something like that. A lot of philosophers throughout history have thought that the universe was infinite. But there's another kind of causation which is atemporal. It's not dependent on time. You could pause time right now, and this would still work. So why is this microphone here right now? Well, because I lifted it up. That's the temporal explanation. But there's another kind of causation called hierarchical causation. The microphone is there because my hand is holding it up currently right now. That's why it's there. It's being held up by the hand. Why is the hand there right now? It's being held up by the arm. Why is the arm there? It's being held up by the shoulder, and so on and so forth. Why am I here? I'm being held up by the chair. Why is the chair here? Held up by the ground. Held up by the earth. Why is the earth held in place? Well, it's held in place by gravity and various sort of physical forces. Well, why are they in place? And as you can see, we've got a kind of causal argument which is not going backwards in time, but is going sort of down to the base. So when people talk about a first cause, hierarchically, they don't mean first chronologically, they don't mean going back in time. They mean going down to the root of what is causing this microphone to be here right now. The interesting thing about that kind of causation, think back to the dominoes. Say the dominoes are A, B, C, D, E, F, G, right? And we're just going to start in the middle. We'll call this one A, and then it goes on. Once A knocks over B, you can take A away, you can throw it in the dustbin. You don't need it anymore. Those dominoes will keep falling over, right? Because once that first one falls over, A falls over, the dominoes are going, you can get rid of that first cause, you can get rid of the second cause and the third one, and the thing will keep on going. Doesn't matter, right? That kind of causation does not need an omnipresent first cause. Doesn't need one that sticks around. So people say, okay, yeah, maybe something set it in place and then went away. Deism, there's no personal God who's sustaining the universe. Now think about that other kind of causation. Hierarchical causation. My hand doesn't have any causal power to hold up the microphone. It borrows it from the arm. Without the arm there, the whole thing would fall down, right? The arm needs to be there right now, otherwise the hand literally doesn't have the power to hold up the microphone. Well, my arm doesn't have any causal power of its own either. It borrows it from the shoulder. And the shoulder borrows that power right now from the body, and the body borrows it from the chair, and the chair borrows it from the ground. If you were to remove any one of those things, the microphone would fall. And so it is not a series of causation that goes backwards in time where you can just remove the first cause. If you remove that first fundamental cause, if you remove the floor, for example, the whole thing collapses right now. And so this is not the kind of causation argument which allows an atheist to say, well, maybe it goes back infinitely. Or, yeah, or maybe there was some kind of first cause, but now it's gone, or he's gone to sleep, or he's not here anymore. It's like, no, it's kind of, you need a first cause as in being most fundamental that is there right now, all the time, holding it in place as we speak. And if you freeze time, that causal chain still exists. And I think that's really exciting, and I think that's more powerful than temporal causation, things like the Kalam cosmological argument, which say that everything needs a cause sort of temporally, or everything that begins to exist has a cause. Because there's so much scope to just say, oh, we don't really know. We don't know what the first cause was. We don't know how far back in time goes. We don't know if the Big Bang was the beginning of everything. Okay, fine. But what about right now, Saying that there was no first cause, or saying that it goes back infinitely, is like watching a painting being painted. And someone says, well, how is that happening? And you say, oh, it must just be like an infinitely long paintbrush, Oh, because the tip of the paintbrush is being moved by this bit of the wood, and that bit of the wood is being moved by that bit of the wood, and that just goes on infinitely. That doesn't explain anything. Suddenly this idea of just, maybe it just goes on forever, just completely fails to explain anything about what you're seeing in front of you, not least why it's drawing a particular painting. So I think that's a really interesting argument for the existence of God. One which I once briefly recounted to Richard Dawkins in a car park, because he asked me, I told him that I didn't like his treatment of Thomas Aquinas and the God delusion, and he said to me in a car park, what would you have had me do, out of interest? And I was like, oh gosh, well, for example, I think you treat all causation as if it's the same. When they're, Thomists think there are multiple kinds of causation. And he said, do you think there are multiple kinds of causation? So yeah, I think there are actually. And he said, well, what are they? And I tried to explain as briefly as I could what I just recounted to you, to which he said, and I quote, I'll never forget the words he said to me, because he said, what the fuck has that got to do with anything interesting? Thank God I'm not a theologian. And then he walked away. And at the time, and he wasn't being rude, he's just like that. And the next time,
believe in theologians.
Yeah, that's so true. But, the next time I saw him, I tried to avoid him because I thought to myself, I would really like it if those were the last words he ever spoke to me. But we have since interacted a fair bit more, so unfortunately, no. But some people find it interesting, some people don't. I think it captures. You asked why it fails. There is still a bit of a weirdness about it. Can you really freeze? If I froze time, there's a sense in which you kind of could remove the arm and the hand would hold up, maybe. I don't know. But also, this is a version of what's called the contingency argument, right? The kind of causation that we're talking about is really explanation, or causation of a particular kind. The contingency argument cashes it out by saying that there are such things as contingent objects, like this microphone. If something is contingent, it means that it could have not been. So I'm wearing a blue shirt right now, and that's a contingent fact, because I could have worn a red shirt. So the fact that it's blue instead of red is contingent on something else, some other thing, like my choice, if you like. Whereas a necessary truth is something which has to be the case. Every circle in the room right now has got no corners, right? That's a necessary truth. That's not contingent on something else, that's just definitionally true. 2 and 2 is 4, that's true in all possible worlds. That's a necessary truth, okay. So the contingency argument says, well, look, you have this series of contingent objects. Why is the microphone there? Well, it's contingent upon my hand. And my hand's there contingently upon my arm, contingently upon my shoulder. You cannot have a contingent chain going on infinitely. And so what they say is it must bottom out at some kind of necessary truth. And if everything must ultimately have some kind of explanation in this sense, or cause, if you like to use that language, and that cause is necessary, we're looking like a necessary existence which is the cause of everything else. And that sounds a lot like God. And that's how you would philosophically cash it out. But there's this objection known as the modal facialism objection, which is about the interaction between necessary and contingent things. So, the contingency argument wants to say that all contingent things are caused by something necessary. The necessary thing causes the contingent thing. I don't think that can be the case. Because I think that if a necessary thing entails a second thing, that second thing is also necessary. If P entails Q, and P is necessary, then I think Q is also necessary. Because if P has to be true, and you have the statement, if P then Q, if P has to be true, then Q also has to be true, right? And so I think as soon as you say that this contingent chain bottoms out in a necessary existence, what you've done is transformed the chain which is reliant upon the necessary existence into a necessary chain. You can imagine that like predeterminism if you want temporally, but we're speaking hierarchically. If a necessary thing causes a bunch of stuff, and is causally sufficient to bring about that stuff, then that stuff is also necessary. So premise one of the contingency argument, that there are contingent objects, evaporates. A little bit techy, sorry, that was a bit a bit wordy, but that is, I think it's more interesting to hear the argument spelled out than the objection, but I think it's worth answering the question. But if anybody wants to chase that up, look up modal fatalism. I know people are going to be here thinking, but a necessary being can still cause a contingent thing because it's like a personal being who makes choices, and maybe we can get into that if people would like to, but that's why I think it fails crudely.
There are lots of arguments for God which involve logic. Where does religious experience fit in? Many have tried to categorize it, succeeded, some potentially succeeded, some failed. Where does religious experience fit in with proving God?
Religious experience seems to be the single best vehicle for proving God to the person who believes. It's very rarely that people will come to belief in God because of some argument or syllogistic reasoning. And I don't think it's supposed to be that way either. Most religious traditions don't have arguments in their scripture. If it were important, it might have been included. You'd have Jesus saying, "Verily I say unto you, premise one, there are contingent objects." You'd probably find something like that in there. And the reason why I think that's not the case is because if God does exist, there couldn't be an intellectual barrier to entry for relationship with him. It would be wrong on an intuitive level, I think, for most people, to suggest that there's a God who loves everybody, but in order to know him, you have to understand the concept. You have to understand all that nonsense that I was just talking about. And if you don't quite get it, if you've missed a step, you weren't following, or you don't quite agree with the logic, you can't be a Christian. That's obviously not how it's supposed to be. And so, for most people, they come to believe through religious experience. The problem is that the religious discussion has become captured by natural theology. Natural theology is the attempt to prove God's existence through arguments and reasons and observations. And it's a really interesting area of theology, but it is not the whole of theology. But people today act as if that's what it's all about. If you're discussing religion, you're talking about arguments for God's existence and atheism and the problem of evil. It's just one small facet, and a controversial facet of theology. A lot of people think it's inappropriate to try to prove God's existence. It's beyond our comprehension. And so I think we need to remember that, for many people, the way it's supposed to be done is through, essentially, experience. The disciples are convinced by religious experiences to follow Jesus, for example. But the problem is, because of the nature of the conversation, where we're talking about arguments and stuff, when somebody comes along and says, well, I believe in God because of a religious experience, and then someone like Richard Dawkins says, well, that doesn't prove anything, Yeah, he's right, but it's kind of not supposed to. It's supposed to do it for you, And so I think it's a perfectly legitimate reason to believe in God. It's probably the only truly legitimate reason to believe in God, but it's non-transferable. And so if anybody here has had one, then lucky you, I suppose.
Recently you've spoken a lot on the Bible and the New Testament. You are agnostic yourself. What wisdom do you think we can still find in the New Testament, and from your perspective as an individual who is agnostic?
Depends what you mean by wisdom, right? Because if you're talking about moral wisdom, Jesus of Nazareth is a celebrated moral teacher, even by atheists. Some of his moral preachings maybe don't make sense if he's not at least a prophet of God. For example, saying if you want to be my follower, you must hate your mother and hate your brother and hate your sister. A lot of people don't understand that the terminology there of hatred kind of means comparative hatred. And elsewhere in the Bible this shows up used in this way, so we know that this is how it was often used. It means if you don't prefer me to your family, right? It sounds a bit culty, right? But the problem with cults is that they're wrong, right? That's what's actually problematic about a cult, is that if you abandon your family and friends to the truth, and it's not the truth, something's gone horribly wrong there, right? But if it actually is the truth, and requires you to abandon things that you care about, including your family, if and when it comes to it, if it really is the truth, then maybe that is actually just worth doing, right? So, some of the wisdom of Jesus' morality might depend on the truth of his claims. But I think there are some genuinely radical ideas in Christianity. I mean, most famously, I think, is loving your enemy. This is this unusual thing to suggest, and it's sort of casually referenced to sort of love your enemy. But you have to imagine an actual enemy, like a genuine enemy. I mean, there are enough people in this room that somebody here has probably had a terrible experience with somebody to the extent that they really hate them, whatever they've done. Or maybe a family member or a friend. Or you can just look at the news and find a story and imagine yourself being a victim or a family member of a victim of one of these horrible circumstances and proactively loving the person who did it. It's a very difficult thing to do. It's a demanding thing to do. But it's a powerful thing to do. There's a great video that went viral not long ago. I think it was some kind of murderer who had multiple victims, and he was sat in the courtroom and just stone-faced. And the victims' families have a chance to stand up and sort of speak their mind. And so these people get up, and understandably they say, look, you're going to go to hell, and I hope that you burn, and I hope that you suffer. And they really lay it on thick. And he sits there just stone-faced. And then this old man stands up, and he says, you've made it very difficult for me to live out my beliefs as a Christian, of forgiveness and of love. But I do forgive you. And the murderer just starts crying. It's like incredibly powerful. I think it's quite unfair to expect that people should be able to have the sort of moral fortitude to do something, or even that, it would be the right decision to make. Perhaps you have a right to be upset and to hate. At the very least, you can't contend that it's quite a radical moral philosophy. So call it wisdom if you agree with it. Don't call it wisdom if you don't, but it's certainly a sort of stark, confronting moral idea to wrestle with. So there's something genuinely unique about that, I think, that comes from Christianity. But there's other kind of wisdom that you can get, like historical wisdom. You can learn things about the ancient world through the reporting of the New Testament, because the New Testament is one of the best preserved ancient documents that we have. And so if you're just looking for like information, if you're just looking for like interesting facts about history and the beliefs of first century Jews and of the early Christian church and stuff, then Christianity is where you want to, or the New Testament is where you want to turn.
Okay, brilliant. That was the last one from me. We're now going to open up to questions from the floor. Please state both your name and college for the purpose of the minutes. Does anyone here have a question? Gentleman in the black jumper.
Erwan Ganga from Justin Butler College. So, given we are in a materialistic world, do you think there is, with the means as we have as humans, is there a limit on what we can discover? So is there a limit of knowledge, or with philosophy or other means we can find the answer for everything, let's say?
Can everybody hear, by the way? If questions are asked, do we need to use the microphone? Okay, I'll try to summarize your question. You tell me if you get it right. You said living in a materialistic world, is there some kind of limit to knowledge? Or and I think it kind of depends what you mean, right? Because there's a sense in which you are always limited in how much you can learn. You can't just know everything instantly, unless perhaps you're God, though you run into some problems doing that too. Is there a limit? If you mean that if you kept learning...
No, I mean, sorry, if there's a limit of the knowledge you can get, not as a person, but as a...
As a society, or Okay, then I think no. Because of course, you run out of time and you die. But if you can conceivably sort of go on forever, do you reach a top? I don't think so. Arguably, you could say that there is a finite number of facts that are true. That in principle, if you knew all of those, you would know everything. But I'm not sure about that, right? Because let's say that you knew all true facts. Let's say you got to where you are. Let's try a reductio ad absurdum and see if it works. Okay, you know all true facts. You've done it. Okay, you've just created a new true fact, which is the fact that you know all true facts. Right? That's a fact. So that's a new fact that you now know. But you've just created a new fact as well, that you know that fact. So that's a new fact that you have to know. And so you would sort of, every single time you sort of conceptually get to the point where you know all true facts, you've just created a new fact. And the new fact is that you know that new fact. And that keeps going on forever. And so there's no sense in which I think you can say that you know all true facts. Because as soon as you say that, you've created a new fact, which you now know, but you didn't know before. So it kind of made it false. So, or no, that wouldn't have made it false. But you see what I'm saying? It's the idea of there being this like maximal number of facts, I think, is wrong. So even in principle, I don't think there's like a finite number of facts to know. Of course, once you reach that point, that kind of knowledge is totally useless. So if you're talking about kind of useful knowledge, then maybe there's like a diminishing returns, right? When you start learning so much that there's much, much more to learn, but the benefit that you get from that knowledge is diminishing and diminishing. That might be the case, but in practice, like no way, there are always going to be new things to learn. Because as we learn new things, we create new endeavors, right? Like when we learn how to create an engine and put it into an automobile, that's a new thing that we know, and you've just unlocked this new like arena of knowledge. Like now people know about different car brands, and they're really interested in cars. And like that's like an area of knowledge with probably an infinite number of facts within it just on its own that was created by some new sort of set of knowledge about the way that engines work. And so I think that will continue and it will just extrapolate. The number of things to know literally gets bigger rather than smaller as we learn new things, So I think maybe the opposite, actually.
Okay, brilliant. Next question. Guy.
Hello Alex, it was nice to meet you yesterday. I have a question that's been widely debated recently, and I'd like to hear your opinion on it. Who would win, 100 men or 1 silver?
I don't know. I kind of actually think that the guys might have it, They're controversial because I've been seeing people on Twitter just posting a picture of a big silverback gorilla and being like, guys, come on, be serious. I'm like, can we organise? Like, do we get time to like plan it? I understand that these animals are like they can tear apart like 10 people without even thinking about it. But if you like distract it with like 80 of the people and 20 of them really get to the bits that matter, like maybe. But I'd much rather be an observer. I suppose the way to answer that question, if you really have to place your bets, is to ask which you would rather be. Who would you actually rather be in that situation? Being honest with yourself, would you rather be the gorilla or the 100 men? Actually, when I think of it that way, I think it's the gorilla. I'd rather be the gorilla. So I think that anybody who says it's the 100 men, like as I've just demonstrated, are suffering from hubris and inability to imagine their own shortcomings. Because when I imagine myself as the gorilla, suddenly the gorilla wins. So maybe there's something subconscious going on. But yeah, I'm giving it to the gorilla.
Thank you very much. Next question. The gentleman in the is it purple with the yeah?
Yeah, it's very
Okay.
We got a microphone?
I think it's on its way to you.
It is travelling down the stairs as we speak.
I was wondering how,
Sorry, can I have your name?
Shazad Kwong, South College, how can you hold people morally accountable if free will doesn't exist?
Good question. You probably can't, at least not in the sense traditionally conceived of, right? And this is one of the biggest qualms that people have with the sort of anti-free will argument. A few things to point out. One is that, like I say, I just think it's false that free will exists. And so suppose there's an implicit criticism in what you're saying, as for many people there are, where they say, like, well, doesn't that undermine our ability to morally condemn people? It's like, if it does, then it does. And that would be an unfortunate fact. But that wouldn't change the logic of there being no free will. The question might be then, well, what do we do? Because we obviously have a meaningful conception of moral accountability that seems to be undermined. But then again, like, do we? There's a philosopher called Susan Wolf who writes about this, and she writes about what she calls the real self view, which tries to account for the difference between me, like, pushing somebody into the train tracks, and me being like nudged and hitting someone into the train tracks. It seems like in one of those cases we want to hold someone accountable, and one we don't. And she tries to account for this by saying, well, one of those is representative of the person's real self. It's the kind of thing that came from whatever you think the self is. It came from there. And so we sort of have practical reason to contain that, in the way that Sam Harris, who introduces a lot of people to the free will discussion with his book on free will, talks about the fact that if you could put a tornado in prison, you would do it. There is this idea, but they're not responsible, so is it morally right to do such a thing? that conversation is kind of already happening, even for people who do believe in free will, in the context of our judicial system, which is a lot of people are saying, like, okay, somebody has committed a murder or they've robbed a store or something, but they had a really hard upbringing and they're living in extreme poverty, and in a way it's kind of not their fault. But even though it's not their fault, we obviously need to do something about it, like we need to take them off the streets. And, well, what should we do? Well, a lot of people are moving towards a rehabilitative view of justice, or in the legal justice system. They say, like, it's not punitive. And in fact, you can see these documentaries of like American prisons. There's one in Arizona, notorious for being like hard-nosed against criminals. All of those criminals go on to reoffend. Every single one of them. Not every single one, but you know what I mean. Like they like, the reoffending rate is through the roof because they've got this philosophy of retribution for what they've done. Rehabilitative prison systems have a much lower reoffending rate. There may be other factors that we're not controlling for. There needs to be more research done. But a lot of people do just think that even though it's not their fault, like ultimately speaking, we need to take them off the streets, but because it's kind of not their fault, the best thing we can do is try to rehabilitate them in some way. If we can have that kind of shift in perspective for ethics as well, I think we'll be in a better and more consistent space. Okay, ultimately it's not exactly your fault that your real self is prone to murdering and harming people. However, we need to do something about it. But can we do something about it that isn't just about moral condemnation because you deserve it, but instead tries our best to rehabilitate them, or to just habilitate them, into what we consider to be moral truth. And in a way, that is what's summed up in the Christian ethical teaching to love your enemy. Because something that people like to do to their enemies is punish them, but the best thing you could do to an enemy, to completely destroy them, is to make them cease being an enemy altogether. And I think that we can probably do that with this view of ethics. But I'm not sure if it will work, because I don't know, hasn't been tried. But that's kind of how I think about it. And it's helpful, you know, like, it's a bit more surface level, the way I actually think about it, but kind of, this might be indebted to the fact that I've spent so long thinking about free will, but if somebody barges past me on the street, and I want to sort of be like, what an arsehole, I think to myself, well, you know, like, maybe his wife's in labour and he's running to get to the hospital, you know? Probably not, right? I'm probably wrong. But it works much better for me to sort of just always act as if it kind of isn't their fault. Well, I'm sure there's a reason, you know? Because the opposite of this, the opposite extreme of this, is when you sort of like, you know, like if you've got like an annoying parent or uncle who is always like overly righteous about stuff, like when the food's a bit cold or the waiter's taking too long and they're like, no, I paid for my meal, and you're sort of like, yeah, you're kind of right, but like, come on, just like it's just not like the right kind of moral vibe. I think push that to its extremity, and that's sort of how I feel writ large. It's like morality is a practical necessity and an emotional expression, and nothing more. So there's no truth or falsity in ethics, but it is a system of emotional expression and societal pressure, I suppose, if I were to put it crudely. Should have ended on the Christianity bit. That was a nicer, sort of rounded moral message. But yeah, I hope that kind of approximates an answer to your question. But I will just also agree with the thrust of your criticism. If it was a criticism, maybe it wasn't, but for some people it is, that yeah, it does just completely undermine our traditional conception of moral responsibility. We have to rethink it if free will doesn't exist.
The blonde lady in the back corner.
We're making him work.
No. Gotta get steps in.
Gabriella Whitley, John Snow. I was just going to ask, do you think there's any way to convince believers that God may not exist, considering that things like religious experience can't be invalidated? And if you think it's possible, what methods would you use if you were set this challenge?
Well, it depends on why they became religious. Like you say, some people become religious because of religious experiences, and those can't be invalidated. Well, some people they can. Like some people reevaluate the religious experience they had and realise that it might have been something else, that they might have been reading into something that wasn't actually there, that they might have been experiencing some kind of psychosis or something that they weren't aware of. But it depends on the nature of the religious experience, because some people say, you know, it's like really weird because I was thinking about Jesus and then I turned around the corner and I just saw a Bible on the floor and I was like, man, I had this experience. That's the kind of experience that very easily somebody could later consider as just a coincidence. But some people have religious experiences where they report like meeting Jesus and shaking his hand and giving him a hug. If they believe that actually happened, that's a very difficult thing to just think, oh, maybe that was a mistake. But people do that too. They think, oh, maybe I was kind of dreaming. I don't know. In such cases, I don't actually really have any reason to talk to somebody else. It's the thing. Like you say, if I was set that challenge, if somebody just said to me, I'm not debating. I'm just someone I've met. Says, yeah, I believe in God because I have this religious experience. I'm not going to go like, oh yeah, well, have you considered this? It's just rude. What's the point? And like, what am I getting out of that? If they say to me, oh, what do you think about that? I'd probably just say, like, that sounds really interesting. I mean, I want to interrogate that particular religious experience. Like, what do you mean about Jesus? Like, you mean physically? Did you see him? What clothes was he wearing? Did he come through the door? Did you just? And it would depend on what they say. But I just wouldn't want to talk them out of it. The only context in which I like proactively am trying to talk someone out of their religious belief is if they like asked me to, or if they've like invited me to implicitly by doing some kind of debate. And if we're having a debate, they're very unlikely to rely on their personal religious experience anyway. So I agree with you that it's very difficult to talk such a person out of religious belief, but I have no intention to do so. And in fact, if religious experience is the truly only like a real legitimate way to come to believe in God, which may not be true, Catholics within Catholicism is literally anathema to the church. Like it's a dogma of the church that you have to believe that God's existence can be proven through reason, which is kind of interesting. If you don't believe that, if you think it can't be proven through reason alone, you're anathema to the church. Or at least that belief is anathema. It's kind of interesting. But if it's true that like religious experience is the only legitimate way to believe, then I'd be kind of glad of saying, let's have this debate where I show you that I think these arguments don't work or are insufficient, because what does that leave? It leaves the thing that makes most people actually believe, which is experience. And it works both ways, by the way. Most people are atheists not because they've thought about it. Oh no, they've got an argument called problem of evil. But for a lot of people, what that's cashed out in is the fact that like their dad died when they were a teenager and they couldn't make sense of it. Which, yeah, you can construct that in argumentative form. You can say, if a good God exists, there'd be no suffering, no suffering. But what's really happened there is an anti-religious experience. You felt something so powerful and so unanswered. In the way that some people report their prayers being answered, some people report the opposite, and it's feeling either way. And in the same way, it's very difficult to talk someone out of that. You could do it, but if somebody said to me, my father died when I was young, and it just made it very difficult for me to believe in God, and I'm like, have you got a contingent object? It would feel a bit inappropriate, But literally speaking, like, that might actually talk them out of it. So it might be possible, but it depends on their susceptibility to argument, and whether they place the experience is more important than the argument. Because for the atheist, they're going to usually place the argument higher than the experience. So they say, well, I've had this experience, but like, I'm an atheist, so that could be it. But this argument has got to exist, so yeah, I'll be talked out of it. But the religious person often places the experience higher than the argument. So even if you put some kind of argument that they think is compelling, the feeling is just too strong. Thomas Aquinas famously didn't finish his Summa Theologica, but the greatest work of metaphysics that any man has ever put to paper. Has a religious experience while performing mass. Looks like he has a seizure, People don't know what's happened to him. And he's seen something, and he stops writing. And his friend and patron begs him to carry on writing. He's got to finish his book. And he says, no, based on what I've seen, like all of my writing is like straw, which is described as straw. Like it's meaningless. I can write no more, he says. Because the experience he had was so strong that what is widely recognized even now, despite Thomas's own revelation in this regard, calling it straw, it's still now recognized as the most important work of Christian metaphysics that's ever been produced. The author himself thought it was literally nothing compared to that religious experience. So I kind of agree that an experience, at least at that time, was very, very difficult to sort out.
Making it easy for Edward, the lady in the grey cardigan.
Elodie Owen, Josephine Public College. You spoke about misword meanings in the Bible. In your example, could the word love be synonym for respect to be said? And how would that change your argument on your opinion?
Yeah, it could. I mean, love is one of these promiscuously defined terms, even in our own modern usage. Like, you love pizza and you love your mother and you love that song you heard on the radio, and you clearly can't mean literally the same thing. There might be something that you could abstract in your relationship with each of those things. It could just mean respect, but I kind of think it means more than that. The full quotation is love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And if you sort of diminish the idea of love to just respect, I can say, I respect you, on with your way in that stuff. But to proactively pray for people who persecute you shows a care, shows the cultivation of a desire for their spiritual welfare, which is what's required of praying for someone, to pray for someone who persecutes you. Pray for someone, if done sincerely, requires that you actually wish them well, unless you're praying for their demise, but I'm not sure that's what Jesus meant. And so I think he has to mean something more than that. He has to mean something like, somehow making your own happiness and contentment contingent upon theirs, even your enemies, maybe even especially your enemies, because that's where love is tested. After all, I think Paul writes about this, right? That it's easy to love those who love you. It's almost transactional. What is love if it is literally just loving people who love you back, or loving people who are good to you, or loving your friends? And the moment you meet someone who doesn't give you what you want, who doesn't love you in return, who is quite nasty, you just don't love them, then what is love? Is it some kind of transactional thing? No, it's got to be consistent, and for Christians at least, it has to be universal. So I think it does mean something more than that. But it is important to note that we're dealing with Greek text here, and as I like to always point out, especially in English, we're reading an English translation of a Greek text, quoting an Aramaic speaker, sometimes quoting Hebrew scriptures. Layers of translation, and there are some words in the Gospels that we just literally don't know what they mean. They are what's known as a hapax legomenon, which means it shows up once in the text, made famous by that university challenge clip of that guy who answers. Some of you know what I'm talking about. There is also something, I forget what it's called, it's really annoying, I keep forgetting it. I think it's called like a T-legomenon. We were talking about this over dinner, where it shows up twice. Because we've got multiple Gospels, that often happens, where actually the word shows up twice, but it's still the same kind of effect. Love is not one of them, but there are all kinds of words like that. Over dinner, I was making a point of interest. The Lord's Prayer in the Gospels shows them two of them. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Most of you will probably know it. Give us this day our daily bread. Except, no. Because the Greek word for daily there is epiousios. No one knows what that means. That word shows up there and nowhere else in any Greek literature. We literally just don't know what it means. So epi, before or above, like as in epilogue. Ousios, like ousia, like essence, substance. Some people translate this as like upon the essence, epiousios. So give us this day our upon the essence bread, the bread we need for today, so daily. But when Jerome translates the Vulgate, the first translation of the Bible into Latin, he looks at this word and it's like epi, super or above, ousios, substantial, super substantial. Give us this day our super substantial bread. And that's still, the Catholic Church still recognises that as a legitimate translation of the words. Catholics really like that because of the Eucharistic undertones of the super substantial bread, right? But we don't know what the word means. We literally just have no idea. I say we have no idea. We can make that etymological guess, but we don't know what Jesus meant by it. And it makes a difference, right? Because if it means give us this day our daily bread, then we're talking about our provision for the day, something quite practical. But if we're talking about super substantial bread, then we're talking about something much different in the way that Jesus says he is the bread of life. And often uses this terminology of bread, or the idea of bread from heaven and this kind of stuff, like a special kind of bread. Our super substantial bread. Bread becomes a metaphor for that feeding that we get from heaven. Completely changes the nature of what we're praying for with the Lord's Prayer. So I would recommend the next time you say it, just to be safe, saying epiousios. But yeah, there's loads of really interesting things like that. And it crops up again in some quite contentious areas, like the word arsenikotoi. Man, bed. Arsen, kotoi. Man, bed. Could mean homosexual. Could not. Quite important when Paul is condemning it, and we don't know what it means. These things crop up quite a lot. That's totally irrelevant to your question, but it's worth noting that a lot of the time it's much harder to do. But with love, I think it's clear what Jesus meant.
Brilliant. Brendan.
Shakespeare says, love is not love which alters when its alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no, it is an ever fixed mark.
I just want to touch upon something we spoke a little bit about on the dinner, and regarding the future of faith. We spoke a bit about the rise of the Orthodox Church. Yeah, but we sort of agree that it's kind of because people just see an edit on TikTok, think that's cool, more than anything else. So, but my question is, in 50 years, what do you think the state of religion in the West will be?
I think it's impossible to say, for multiple reasons. First, sociological predictions are difficult to make at best times. Second, I'm not a sociologist. It's really not my area of expertise. If you my general feeling is a bit like yours, which is that things ebb and flow, and they ebb and flow over the course of a few hundred years, but they also do it over the case of decades. New atheism was really popular. It was a publishing phenomenon that crops up in the sort of early millennium, turn of the millennium, and it becomes pretty popular for a decade or two. And people kind of get bored. The conversations have been done. Oh yeah, the problem of evil. It's not to say that it's useless, but people have thought about it now. They're bored of it. You can imagine. It's crazy to think that in the way that today, if you turn on Fox News and you've seen people debate social justice issues, and it's all over the place. Not that long ago, they were doing the same thing with evolution and God. It's so strange to think. Because now it seems a little bit strange. People kind of got bored. And now it's getting interesting again because atheism became cool, and the coolest thing to do is to be against the grain. So atheism was cool, it was kind of against the grain, then atheism became the norm. Now to be against the grain, it's cool to be religious again. But notice that it's not so much natural theology anymore. People aren't really doing the Kalam cosmological argument, right? It's got a lot more to do with Bible and doctrine and church history and tradition and stuff, and that's becoming kind of cool again. Because it's existing in a cultural space, People are upset about what's happening to their culture, and they want to use the tradition of Christianity as a bulwark against it. And actually, maybe that's legitimate, because Christianity is true. It probably provides the kind of fruits that would protect your civilization. So it's not an illegitimate truth about Christianity that it would do that. But I think that's probably mostly the motivation behind the kind of stuff that you're talking about, which is why people are being converted as much by sermons and clips of sermons on TikTok as they are by pictures from films of crusades and being Me with the Boys, if we let our true thoughts win, flags and metal helmets and yeah, I get that, yeah, cool, awesome, feels great. I think a lot of it is probably just that. But trends over the broader trajectory are much harder to predict. Religion is obviously, and by religion I mean religiosity, a feeling of belief in something more than the material, the immateriality of the soul, life after death, the numinous, is clearly quite universal, anthropologically speaking, across human societies. We're not so clever that we we worked out now and all of that's BS. I don't think that's going away. It might change how it's manifested, but I think, the way that people would predict, religion is on the decline, with the implication that one day basically the world's going to go atheist. I think you've got as much chance of the world going vegan.
Just raise your glasses. Oh, there's two. We'll go with both. We'll go with both.
Hi Alex. I'm an atheist, locked in a debate with my Christian friend about whether humans are fundamentally different from animals. Is it a difference of degree or a difference of kind? You've spoken about how, you're an atheist, we're not made in God's image, we haven't got some sort of special free will in your book. And you spoke about how difficult it is translating human rights onto animals. So for you, is there anything that makes humans meaningfully unique, a difference of kind, not of degree? Or are we just animals?
Well, it's a paradoxical question in some respects, because we're sort of dealing with taxonomy here, which is what is the difference between human and other animals? I think this problem kind of crops up in all kinds of taxonomy. What's the difference between a pig and a cow? There is a difference. The reason why the human thing is important is because we have a sort of distinct moral treatment of humans and cows. But that is conceptually dependent upon first having distinguished them, just literally. Before you consider how to differently morally treat them, you need to literally see them as different things. So what is the difference between a human and a cow, like literally speaking? What's the difference between a cow and a pig? Like, yeah, you could point to certain features, like the curly tail and the number of legs or whatever, but if you were to resurrect all of the evolutionary chains between them, it'd be very, very murky, where like the common ancestry goes far back enough that it sort of no longer really counts as a cow, no longer really counts as a pig. It's just very difficult to put labels around things. And I think that's true of the entire world, by the way. I think it's very difficult to account for the existence of objects. There's this view called mereological nihilism, which I'm a really big fan of, which sort of denies the existence of objects. You know, one of the great mysteries of Plato is the problem of the one and the many. This is a microphone, that is a microphone. They're not the same thing. These are two separate objects, but they are the same thing, because they're both microphones. But what is it, that one's over there, this one's over here, what is it they've got in common that makes them both kind of the same thing in some sense? For Plato, it's like the forms. They both participate in the form of microphones, right? For me, I'm a nihilist about the idea that they are the same thing. Any more than this is the same thing as that sheet of paper. Reason being, this is a really long-winded answer to your question. Reason being that, like, I don't think that anything, like, when does this microphone begin to exist? At some point, it was put together, but nothing began to exist. Nothing new came into existence. Took a bunch of pre-existing material, a bit of metal, some bits and bobs, atoms essentially, arranged them in a particular way, and called it a microphone. But nothing new has actually begun to exist. The only thing that has come into existence is a new form. It's quite important in Thomistic metaphysics, actually, you know, like matter and form creating objects. For me, I'm like, we've just got matter and arrangements, and we put labels on it. So there is no real distinction between the microphone and the telephone over there. We've just got a bunch of atoms that are arranged in a particular way, but to conceive of them as a microphone and a telephone, as distinct kinds of objects, just requires your mind. The best way to conceive of this is to ask, like, does the left-hand side of this microphone exist? The answer is yes, because what I'm calling the left-hand side of the microphone, this thing here, it exists, it's here, you can touch it. But clearly, to like call it the left-hand side of the microphone as a concept distinct from the right-hand side of the microphone requires my mind. Right? So it's not like this concept, this bracketed like thing called the left-hand side of the microphone exists. That's just a mental invention. But the thing that I'm describing with that concocted label does exist. See what I mean? I think the distinction between the left and the right-hand side of the microphone is the same as the distinction between the microphone and the telephone, which is to say that like they both exist. Like, does the telephone exist? Yeah, it does. But to call it a telephone, in that it participates in some like group that all telephones fall into, this microphone is some group, that group is up here. But the things I'm describing really do exist. I think that applies to animals too, of course, naturally. So, you know, do pigs exist? Yes. But like this label of pig is a mental construction. But it's much easier to just do that mental construction when you have these huge gaps in the evolutionary tree, right? Like the difference between a human being and a chimpanzee is so wide that it's very easy to know where to conceptually draw the line. In the same way that the microphone and the telephone, very easy to see the difference. But if I sort of somehow started slowly turning the microphone, that's got a microphone in it, right?
Alright guys, I need to lock up now.
Well,
Really?
alas. Was it something I said? What time is it?
Well, that wasn't meant to happen.
Well, look, no bother. We can do this outside. Seek me after class. Let's
Yeah, actually, yeah, that's.
let's do that. I mean, I don't.
So Alex will be coming over to our bar at 24 North Bailey. You're all invited to come along. For those who ask
What time is it?
It's 10:15.
Oh, bloody hell! It is kind of late. So we have to be out at 10 or what?
Yeah, because his job ends, so you gotta.
See, okay. Let's not be utilitarians about this. Come on. Have you not heard of rights? You know. Gosh. No, that's fair enough. But yeah, I was only just beginning to approximate and answer your question, unfortunately. But the long and short of it, since we're being kicked out, is that there is no difference. That is to say, like, the distinction between objects is not a real distinction, but a mental distinction. That's what the mereological nihilist says. And so the same thing is true of animals. and so the difference between them is literally whatever you decide it to be. Otherwise, everything is the same. I was going to ask if your friend believes in evolution. Does your friend believe in evolution?
Yes, but as a mechanism like of God.
Cool. So if he does, and just I would say begin with this line of inquiry. Be like, okay, at least in principle, then what's happened here is trace human species back far enough. You get like an ancient ancestor who, for whatever reason, is not able to inherit eternal life. Is qualitatively different from the human being. At some point, that line of evolution, the Imago Dei comes up. Now, either the Imago Dei is something which evolves, and so you're kind of made in the image of God, and then more, and that doesn't seem right. It seems like you either have it or you don't, right? So he's trying to make a distinction. What that means is that at some point, an aged ancestor gives birth to another aged ancestor, and God breathes life into that aged ancestor. They are now made in the Imago Dei, whatever that means. The breath has been breathed into their nostrils, which means that they now suffer and live and fight and try to survive just like their mother does. But that aged ancestor, who presumably also can't use language, can't speak, has not much of a community, that aged ancestor now can be redeemed from their suffering. They now have the chance of inheriting eternal life. But their mother can't. Qualitatively different kind of animal. Maybe that is just true. Maybe God just breathes in. It seems a little bit arbitrary and a little bit unfair. There's obviously lots more to say about that, but we are getting kicked out. I'm so sorry. But let's maybe move outside and try and talk.
A round of applause.